Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight for the Standard Speaker Series. I am thrilled to welcome my good friend, Scott Belsky. It may come as no surprise that the author of the book, Making Ideas Happen, is a person who's made many things happen, both in his life and his career. Before we start the conversation, I thought I'd share just a few highlights. In 2005, Scott founded the company Behance, which became the leading creative platform for portfolio sharing and discovery. It was a long journey for him and his tight-knit team, which he chronicles in his second book, The Messy Middle. He's many stories that came out of it. One that Scott retells is that at a certain point, having basically no money or anything else to incentivize his team with, Scott, who is a lifelong vegetarian, promised that if they passed a certain milestone that seemed infinitely far in the distance, that he would eat meat. Of course, they blew through that milestone and many more, resulting in an unloved chicken dinner for Scott, but also ultimately in the intention of tech powerhouse Adobe, who acquired Behance in 2012 in what at the time was one of the larger startup exits. Today, Scott is the Chief Product Officer at Adobe. He is the creative force behind Acrobat and Illustrator, Premiere and Photoshop, the whole suite of products that is what to the creative world, what Microsoft Office was to a generation of office workers. And it's really hard to understate, hard to overstate Scott's influence in the creative world. Not only is he the architect of these products that are the backbone of the creative economy, he's also a very successful venture capitalist and seed stage investor in that world, having backed many companies you've probably heard of like Uber and Pinterest, Cheddar and Periscope, to name a few. More recently, Scott has become interested in crypto and crypto art, which I hope we'll talk about. On a personal note, I will tell you that I owe great debt to Scott because he is the one person among my friends who was crazy enough to argue that I should buy Bitcoin without apology or hesitation, but was also sane enough that I actually listened to him. So I will tell you, drinks are on me after this, Scott. He is a person who, in all the free time you might imagine that he has, is become a prolific writer with 2 books. He founded a creative think tank called 99U, written numerous articles and blog posts about the creative economy. From my perspective, he has been an incredibly articulate narrator of a moment that we all experience, which is this middle moment. A moment when you don't have the excitement of the start of a race, nor the glory of a finish, but it is just you suffering out there and suffering often alone or with a small group of people who aren't fully understood. And one of the things he's argued so compellingly is that it is in those moments that creativity happens and outcomes are often determined. And those are the moments we often overlook. It's an idea that I've taken with me on a lot of the journeys we all have been through, which are, as you know, often circuitous and certainly not linear. And so I hope you all get a lot from this conversation with Scott tonight. Before we jump in, one editorial note, which is, as always, we will have time for your questions at the end. Just put them in the Q&A box on Zoom as we go, and we will get there. So with that, Scott, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. And I don't know how I'm going to possibly live up to that intro. It was very generous, and no, but I'm thrilled to be with you and your team.
So excellent. So let's start. I mean, I think it's only appropriate we start in the middle, to talk about this idea of the messy middle and what inspired that. With the motivating idea behind that.
Yeah, I mean, the writing projects have always really been inspired by frustration to some degree, and also Behance as well. I mean, these were all, Behance was inspired by my frustration with how disorganized the creative world was, and how no one ever got attribution for their work, and everyone's career was at the mercy of circumstance. Making Ideas Happen was just about how how creatives just suffered idea to idea syndrome and never got anything done, and how the best creatives in the world actually compromise some of their creativity to actually improve on their productivity. The messy middle was a real major frustration with how obsessed we are with starts and finishes. And I think the press and all the headlines, anything that we feel, compelled to read, any headline that captures our attention is typically about the success or failure of something. And and maybe there's a romanticism around the start, but then the everything that happens in between is just this seemingly perpetual volatility. This living amidst ambiguity, anonymity, uncertainty, anxiety, and it's not really a sexy part of the journey to talk about. But I just became increasingly convinced that the companies and leaders that I admired most, really were grown and became who they were from those middles, and it was all about enduring the lows and optimizing the highs. So that was the project to chronicle some of that.
Yeah, it's fascinating because even in trying to write an introduction, you start at the beginning, you hit the end, and it's impossible to capture that middle and kind of what the lived experience of it is. You talk a bunch about endurance, endurance and enduring the lows. What is that a virtue that is in some sense overlooked, or how do we hone endurance for the middle?
Well, if you think about the volatility, right? There's lows and
Yeah.
highs in any business, as regulatory issues change, the economy changes, commodity issues, to whatever the things are. I know you always are dealing with in your business. And whatever, whether we find ourselves at the lows or the highs, it's first important to recognize that we're not our best selves at either point. At the lows is when we typically make decisions out of fear. We start to get threatened by competition and get afraid, and then start to churn plans that really just needed to stay intact long enough to materialize, right? So we're not our best selves at the lows. We're not our best selves at the highs, because we tend to falsely attribute the things that worked to the things that we did. And it's not really necessarily always a correlation there. There are many other factors, including timing, et cetera. So in either instance, we need to employ some tactics, and you asked specifically about endurance. I mean, one of the ones that I think about all the time is, it's easy to say we want to innovate and make something happen, but of course it takes so many years. And I often like to say that the secret competitive advantage of startups that succeed is just sticking together long enough to figure it out, right? What keeps a team engaged with something that is not obvious long enough to really see it to fruition? And what we're fighting against is our own innate reward system. The fact that we were all kind of born with this short-term reward system that is purely biological. I mean, the average lifespan not so long ago was like 24, 25 years old. So the idea of committing 5 to 10 years of your life to something that you're not getting like a trickling reward stream from is kind of insane, right? And so in order to defy that, it's one thing to have a strong vision for something and take a career risk to pursue it, or, make an investment that you might lose. But it's another thing when you're in month 6, month 12, month 24, month 37. And so I believe that a big part of that endurance phase is hacking that reward system for a team, manufacturing a set of rewards that are directional, but are, another funny one that I think you heard me talk about in the book was, we used to type in Behance into Google, and it always said, do you mean enhance? Do you mean enhance? And we were like, all right, so before we, become a big company and have revenue, we're just not going to be a mistake anymore. Let's get enough, enough search engine optimization. Let's get enough portfolios up there. And then, lo and behold, that started in 2006, and in early 2007, an engineer typed in Behance and it said Behance. And we were like, wow, that was one of those milestones that was hacking our reward system. And I kid you not, in 2008, Bonsai became super popular and we lost our SEO all over again. That's what it's like. Exactly. So anyways,
Yeah.
and then narrating the journey. The last little analogy I'll say is, when you're bringing a team through one of these, long periods of, and it's almost like you're driving a car on a 3-day cross-country journey with the windows blacked out in the back seat. And if you don't narrate the team around the progress you're making, they'll go crazy and they'll get out of the car, right? And so how do
Yeah.
you become a merchandiser of progress? Because we know from a lot of research that progress begets progress, that the feeling of progress incites more, and we have to feed that.
Right. How, it's interesting because I feel like the received wisdom, at least maybe to the layperson from the startup ecosystem or the tech ecosystem, is this moment of move quickly, fail fast, pivot, pivot, pivot. And is there in some sense a tension between that idea and the idea of endurance that maybe we don't show enough fidelity to, to our ideas, because any new ideas is naturally going to be rejected. It wouldn't be a new idea if it weren't. And that in fact this this idea that we kind of idealize the pivot, we're not idealizing endurance enough.
It's funny because we have a mutual friend who talks about the lean startup and the MVP, right? And Eric and I have had Eric Reese and I have had
this is Scott contra Eric.
Right. No, I mean we've had at least one or two social media debates on this, because I have seen many times that a team's desire to get the most minimum viable product out and just ship fast and learn and market typically underestimates the gravity of whatever you do in fact put out there. Because what happens when you launch something is that you're launching something that only illuminates a small amount of the design space of possibility around it. And so your iterations at that point are simply just that, iterations. And I've seen a number of instances where I believe that if a team had more firmly baked a product that was more thoughtfully considered and was injected in based on a lot of iteration before launch, which would have taken more time and more crafting of the details that make a big difference. I think that maybe could have landed the team in a place that was a better place to iterate, and maybe even was the difference between succeeding and failing. So, listen, there's a great tension here. You want to ship fast, you want to learn and market, and yet at the same time, the things that will truly differentiate you in market and are most extraordinary about your product, you need to get perfect. And those things should have polish, right? And those things should be, your absolute best foot forward. How do you reconcile those two is part of that journey?
Yeah. What, obviously, these were lessons drawn from a startup where I think you joked at one point that the guy at the fruit stand had more customers than you had. And you spent a lot of time at, Adobe, which is, basically a $250 billion company. How applicable are these lessons at scale, right? At a, for the journey people are, when you are the market leader and in a large corporation?
Well, in a large corporation, you sustain success through like a very powerful immune system that kills off things that could bring risk into the equation or get you off track or sacrifice a quarter. And that immune system is what makes a company great. And some companies like Apple are famous for their immune systems in the sense that when a product isn't perfect, they just kill it well before we all see it. And also when a person, from the outside doesn't graft properly onto a team, they just get that person out of the system. It's a tight immune system. Occasionally, you need an organ transplant, right? And what does a doctor do when you have an organ transplant? They suppress your immune system so you can take on something entirely new and not reject it. And so I think that the playbook from the startup world that we were just talking about is the playbook for surgery in the organ transplants in the big companies. And there aren't many people typically in an executive suite that have that playbook, because typically to rise the ranks of a big company, you have to just be in the company. But there are some corporate innovators who are known for the ruckus that they cause and can occasionally blunt the immune system well enough, right? I mean, my cheat code in my career for this at a big company has been design, has been prototypes. And I always like to say a prototype is worth 100 meetings. I have sat around tables and argued about whether a product's experience should be inverted and whether we should totally change, something at the core. And people have all these philosophical arguments and debates based on all these other, forces at play. But then when you walk everyone through a prototype, it's like a hot knife through the butter of bureaucracy. Everyone just no one can argue about it. And I think that applies even to a business like yours, where you're walking people through like a narrative of what the market could look like, what the offering could be. And it's harder to debate. And that I think is the process of innovation in a big company.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned design, because obviously it is top of mind for you. You've thought and written about it a lot. So let's ground that conversation, because I'm while I'm sure it's top of mind in Adobe, I don't know if in the broader industrial world and building materials, whether we think enough about it. So what is design to you? What is not design? What are the hallmarks of good design that you think about? What are the principles?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, obviously there have been books written by a lot
Yeah.
smarter people than I about what is design. But I mean, for me, it's a few different things, right? It's customer centricity. So it's really understanding in a holistic level where the customer's head is at, which is not just about a product thing. It's also a insight into their insecurities. How do they want to project themselves to others? How do they want to make a decision and make sure they're not feeling taken advantage of? How do they feel informed? I mean, it's a very like customer centric approach to designing an experience. And even though you may be selling materials and and I may be selling cloud software, at the end of the day, our customers are having an experience with us, like an end-to-end experience with us. And which leads to my second definition of design, which is the small things that make a big difference. And so you can look at an end-to-end experience and say, we don't need to have polish of that, or it doesn't matter what that brochure looks like, or it doesn't matter whether we have a email follow-up to the customer, whatever. But these are all end-to-end pieces. And that's funny. Like, customers typically don't rave about the core of a product. They rave about the parts of the product experience they didn't expect. And but how do you get a team that's so focused on the bottom line and shipping and the realistic nature of the day-to-day business and the quarter by quarter goals to prioritize things that are not core, that are ultimately the things that the customers rave about is part of the challenge.
Right. So I'll put that question back to you. How do you do that? How do you create a culture? I mean, I think you've articulated why design is important for a company, but how do you create a culture where design is part? I mean, it has to be more than having a design department.
Yeah.
Or how do you integrate it into a culture?
It's I have a mentor, a man named James Higa, who was the right-hand man to Steve Jobs for many, many years. Early Apple, on to Next, and then back to Apple. Was in his business card said Office of the Chairman. It was one of those like nondescript roles. Steve would task him on all sorts of projects, but the one thing that James did with Steve and many of his direct reports over many, many years is he would take them to Japan. And they would do these walks and these visits of like the Noguchi sculpture gardens and certain restaurants and certain spots that really epitomize the very Japanese specific appreciation for design and detail and efficiency and thoughtfulness and like the small things that make a big difference. That's I think one of the things I love about that culture generally. And so I've gone on a number of trips with James. I've joined since this U.S. Japan Tech Council that James is a part of. And so we go on these trips with entrepreneurs or product designers, and we go through the itinerary that Steve would take his people through with James. Yeah. And what I learned from that is that this was, in this case, Steve Jobs' way to get his team to appreciate those small things that make a big difference, is to see them in a system and then discuss like, why was that experience so special buying a book at that store, in Tokyo? Right. It was because of the way that they crafted the wrapping paper on the book when they gave it to you, and the way they put it in the bag was so, thoughtful, and like, the way they tied that. And it's like, well, if we're talking about that now and we appreciated that so much, how do we manifest that in like the packaging of an Apple product, right? Yeah. And so I think part of it is the things you expose your team to, the things you appreciate and allow time for and resourcing for. I mean, most companies, if designers came and said, can you give us like a 30% increase in the budget for packaging? They'd be laughed out of the room. Like, are you kidding me? No, right? So I think it's part of those things. And I would, the hack for me is to really think of every product as an end-to-end experience as opposed to just a product. And then start asking yourself questions as to what fills the rest of that experience.
Right. It's funny that on the packaging, our Chris Rector, our chief marketing officer, redid all the packaging. Was one of the first things he did when he arrived, and didn't even realize it, but this stuff sits like, forever in people's front yard, and it looked like a dumpster originally, right? Now it's like beautiful and bright, and like no one ever thought to do this.
Right.
But it is
a great example.
Small things that that make a big difference. It doesn't look like a trash pile anymore.
Right.
So what, I mean, are there aspects of corporate culture that make, individuals who are creative, who have a flair for design? I mean, besides what you say, besides, giving the exposure, are there aspects of corporate culture that attract those individuals, that allow those individuals to flourish?
Well, design typically doesn't have a seat at the table in most corporate cultures, and design is oftentimes treated as an agency, an internal agency. In fact, design internal agencies typically then end up feeling insulted whenever a project is important and it's given to an external agency. So they're like, wait a second. So I'm treated as an internal agency, but if it's exciting work, it's given to the external agency.
Yeah.
And that doesn't attract and retain the best talent, of course, because that's, the inverse of what you'd want to do that. But what you can start to do is make sure that, and I won't use the word design, I'll use the word creative, whether that's represented by your chief marketing officer or a creative officer, or someone whose job is to really, think about both the brand, the customer experience people are going through in various products of ours. And I'm not just talking the consumer, in your retail business. I'm also saying on the B2B side. I mean, another big awakening for me lately has been the consumerization of enterprise experiences. Yeah. These are the people that are using that admin console in some big enterprise product or transaction, platform are still people. They've got iPhones. They have an expectation to have things be simple and to have great default experiences and progressive disclosure of all the choices as opposed to seeing them all at once on one big panel. So, making sure that those folks have a seat at the table, are represented as opposed to just told what to do, making sure they have a stamp of approval on what ships. That's another thing I advise a lot of my friends who are trying to bring design into their businesses to do, is to say, I say to them, so you might have great people at the start of the project and they come up with this vision, but then at the end, when it actually goes to the printer or goes to this or goes to that or is manufactured, are they there again to like make sure that it is what they envisioned? And usually the answer is no.
Yeah. It's funny, you mentioned Apple a few times. Obviously, the best of the best in terms of design. I think it's goes without saying. Are there companies, that are, not in the tech world, whose design, ethos you've really been attracted to?
Wow, I think there are a number. Let me think about who they would be. I mean, another one which is in the tech world, I guess, but also not as Airbnb. Obviously the way that they've, they're just a booking hotel company. I mean, it's like, but if you go through the experience of Airbnb versus a Hilton, it's just you feel like there is a different drive there. And I happen to know that team is super focused on it. I think that there are so many variations. I think that certainly Nike, is obviously a great example, and and they're a big customer of ours. So I've gotten some insight into how they produce. They're actually one of those companies that reinforce another belief of mine, which is that at the end of the day, like the product a company ships represents the DNA of that company.
Yeah.
And so that idea of like shipping your org model, you also like ship the truths about how a team really works. If if the packaging designer, for example, was involved in the process, you feel that they were all involved in the process when you open that box. But if he or she wasn't, you're like, wait a second, like this box is too big for this thing. And it's, so you can kind of tell sometimes. So I guess that's another example.
Okay. I just want to remind everybody to submit your questions. We've got, about 15 or 20 more minutes, and then we'll jump to your questions. But first, my questions. So, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I, in an organization where you're always trying to, drive costs out that you mentioned, I think that goes to design, but, is a bit counterintuitive is this idea. I think you said at one point that, doing something the harder and more expensive way oftentimes creates a much more differentiated product, because if you do something, the less expensive way, most teams will immediately have access to it. It's curious how you build that into a culture that inevitably is, every corporate culture is looking at costs.
Right. Yeah, no, I think we're really talking about the, whenever you get friction in making something happen, there is the disappointing and frustrating side of you that's like, oh, I have to solve this problem. I have to, whether it's a cost issue or a production issue or a supply, whatever. But then there's also another side of you that's like, well, if I solve it, that's another, another inch of the moat, right? That someone has to jump over to compete with me.
Yeah.
And so, I think I go both ways. Don't get me wrong. Like, I scrutinize costs tremendously. I work in a business where cloud costs are escalating rapidly. And, I'm always trying to be creative, not just about what the product can be, but also how it can be more efficient. And, I think that's one of those, it's maybe a cultural thing about the nature of creativity and organization. Are you engaging the people that are creative, not only in what could be created, but also how it could be created more efficiently? Another answer I could have given you for the question of what is design is removing things. A lot of people say the best design is invisible. Like, the whole point of that is, having this breakthrough, and oftentimes those breakthroughs reduce costs. And so I think, and I think Apple actually is also good at that. They remove things all the time that that probably reduce the cost of their products, but they do so in a way that is driven by thoughtfulness and customer centricity.
Right. So let's zoom out for a second, because I want to talk about this historical moment of creativity and the rise of this creative economy. And there's a number of angles to this, but you've talked about this concept of the productivity creativity inversion, and describe that, because I think it's a fascinating idea.
Yeah. So, well, the idea here is that we have, as humans at work, right? We have stood out forever, really, based on our productivity, right? So the blacksmith who hammered a little faster and had a better technique was the one who got promoted, right? And then it was the person who did more calculations more quickly that got promoted. And then Microsoft Office was deployed to all of us, and this productivity set of tools was intended to make us all more productive. And that's our whole education system was essentially geared to make us more productive. And now we're reaching this fascinating moment where productivity in many instances is better achieved through algorithms and machines and artificial intelligence than a human being more and more productive at that. And so now, if it's transcription, for example, done. Like, there's just no world in which a human is more productive than a machine when it comes to transcription, which is a massive business. And we can just keep going on. And obviously AI is just going to keep ticking things off that list. And so then the question is, well, what will make humans stand out going forward and be promoted and succeed in the workplace? And it's less about productivity now. It's more about creativity. It's about visualizing data in compelling ways. It's about, me coming into, your executive team and presenting something that moves you in such a way that it helps you make a decision better. That's what would get me promoted. Now, is that something that Microsoft is helping me accomplish, or is that something that I'm accomplishing through, better ways of visualizing data, telling a narrative? Am I going to convince you to make a change with a report or in a PowerPoint? Or maybe if I make an animation showing how the world can work, how your distribution chain could function, maybe everyone sort of starts to see the light of something that is truly innovative, right? And so if those are the skills of the worker that stands out in the workplace of the future, then we need to deploy creativity tools, much like we needed to deploy productivity tools. And of course, I'm very self-serving in this vision because my job is to make creativity tools. But it also means we have to make different types of creativity tools. I mean, you're not going to have to learn. You shouldn't have to learn how to use Creative Cloud products like Photoshop. We should have just incredible tools that do things for you. But that's what I mean by that productivity, creativity inversion.
Right. Does it mean that we, obviously we have kids the same age, which people on the call, would not know, but does it mean we need to be educating people differently? I mean, can creativity be taught? And, when you hire great creative minds, are you selecting for something totally different than what our educational system was optimized for? I know this is sort of a big question. We're not going to solve it today, but I'm just curious.
Well, we can agree that all of these skills we're talking about shouldn't be confined to a weekly art class every Friday at 3, right? I mean, we need to infiltrate the entire curriculum. So if you're doing a science report or if you're doing a history report, you're using creative tools to showcase your work so that you become, very talented and capable of using these skills to visualize your own ideas. Obviously the new generation of social media tools like TikTok and Instagram and others, you could argue that there's a lot of dangers for our kids using those, but at the same time, it's also teaching them how to creatively express themselves, which will be more important in the future for professional reasons, not just for their own egos. So I do think that the education system needs to change, and I think that the skills we look for as we hire people to succeed in the workplace need to challenge us to think differently.
You said if you weren't doing what you're doing, you'd be a writer.
Oh man, I don't know where your diligence is coming from, but as everyone knows on this call, like David has really good diligence. He always knows exactly.
So what's the role of why a writer? What's the role for words and language, and the role for creative visualization of things? I mean, is there a tension between the two? Is there a place where language best serves us and visual tools?
Well, it's funny. I've been thinking a lot about memes lately, and memes, as everyone knows, are really having a huge impact on culture right now.
Yeah.
And I've become convinced that memes, they're knowledge compression technologies that can very efficiently hack culture as well as pierce through rationality. I mean, look at Doggy Coin, this like booming new cryptocurrency that was literally made by someone who I actually know, this guy Jackson Palmer, as a joke. I mean, he was literally joking. And he made it so that there were 5 billion more created every year automatically, just to make the point that it should be worthless. And now it's worth a lot. And he hates this. I mean, he's just like,
it's gonna be worthless.
Right. I mean, I'd imagine, right? But the mimetic like forces behind it are what's driving its value. And so that's an example, though, of white papers and books and whatever could never have achieved that. But a simple graphic that showcases and packages like a very powerful message about something in culture or society at the moment is very powerful. So how do we become capable of making those things? I think is a good question.
Well, the point you made, which I used to think about, which was a big philosophy of language question about like how constrained our thinking is by language. But you made a point which I thought was really elegant about the desire for creative individuals to try to give an elevator pitch of their ideas by boxing it into, this is Uber for massage, or this is, and how that can be kind of potentially constraining on the creative process, because the minute you box something with a linguistic framework that that comes from something else, you're immediately locking yourself into a whole framework that you may not be, that you may in fact be trying to get away from.
Right. I mean, it's in having been in the venture capital like early stage ecosystem for quite some time now, it's that this is what infects entrepreneurs, is that some model works and everyone tries to then stick something to it without realizing that that model they're trying to replicate, that company, they weren't the something of something, so it's like, well, why would then your thing become as big as that if
Right.
and so it's and as I've a lot of the best investments at that early stage are based on deep insights into the way society is changing, and something that is of course not obvious at the time, and stands on some pillars of like indisputable trends, right? I mean, with Uber, it was the fact that there was just excess supply that was never utilized of drivers, and there was a need for people. We used to have those little paper slips that we would give to the dispatcher at the curb, and then they would like get in the car, and it was just so inefficient. So there were some major insights that whole thing was based on. But no, I think it is constraining. At the same time, it's our like default, right? We always want to find patterns. So my cardinal rule around it is as follows: is that familiarity, right, is a very good way of breeding utilization in things. Like, we shouldn't come up with creative terms for terminology that we just want everyone to like understand and click through, right? But occasionally you need to like retrain the way people think, and that's where you should sort of do something that doesn't fit a mold like that. So I'm all for like referencing companies all day, every day for things we should be doing based on what's worked, because those are familiar patterns that we should leverage in our own businesses. But also like recognize that when it comes to those organ transplants, I guess we talked about earlier, don't try to look like somebody else. Like, base that on the pillars of insight that you have in your space.
Yeah. Okay, changing topics. What's the furry Lisa?
Furry Lisa. Oh wow, we're about to dig down the rabbit hole here.
Yes. Straight down.
I'm about to lose my credibility with all of you. But so we've all a lot of you probably heard about this term, the NFT, or the non-fungible token. And so this is Bitcoin is a fungible token, meaning that I can give you a Bitcoin, you give me a Bitcoin. We don't really know the difference. But the idea of a non-fungible token on the blockchain is that it's a token that is really unique as an artifact. And if I give it to you, you give it to that person gives it to that person, it's all chronicled in the ledger forever. And so it really carries provenance. You can see who's owned it before you, and future people can see that you've owned it. And so as a model, it's a very interesting proxy for how the physical art world works. You go into a gallery and they say, oh, this piece right here, is made by so-and-so, whose collectors include this person, and that person. And this is the price that people have been paying for their work. And all this stuff you're hearing from some gallery person who's obviously trying to get you to buy something. And so then you kind of wonder, so is there a way to leverage the blockchain to do that better for art? And the best place to start is digital art. Digital art has never been valuable because it's never been rare. And so what happened is a number of artists, many of whom started on Behance, started minting their digital art to the blockchain using one of these non-fungible tokens, NFTs, and collectors started to buy them and sell them to other collectors. And then the value of them started to go up. And suddenly there became a network or a market for digital art, much like there is for physical art. Now, of course, a lot of people are like, well, I don't get it. You can't put it on your wall. You can't look at it. Like, I can get a JPEG and I can say I own it. And I always remind those folks, first of all, 90 something, I think it's 94, 96% of all physical art is in storage. So, and baseball cards, other collectibles people don't look at every day, but they just love to know that they own them. And I can put the Mona Lisa on my wall in my living room right here. I can get a poster, right? And you'll probably assume it's not real, but I can certainly get a replica that looks real. So what really determines the provenance of that is the history, which in fact is better represented on the blockchain than it is in the physical world. Because at least on the blockchain, you know it's real and it can't be fabricated, it can't be faked. So the furry Lisa was one of the early crypto minted pieces of art by a person who was on Behance, and I bought this piece, and it meant a lot to me because it was supporting an artist I'd admired for years. Many of these artists never had a way to make money from collectors. They just did commercial work, and it also represented this idea of a reinterpretation of traditional art. And since then, of course, this whole world has gone a little nuts, and so I'm sure it will ebb and flow with time. But over time, I do believe it's here to stay.
Yeah, it has huge impact just for the democratization of access of artists to the art world. And I would think changing their economics too.
It does. And the idea of an NFT, by the way, also is something we're going to see a lot more of, because now all kinds of artists, musicians, people who basically have their time as a resource and, trying to build a audience. And it goes to the creator economy point you made earlier about this whole conversation. Mm-hmm. This is about people who create stuff, being able to monetize it directly with their audience. Another little snippet, and I'll stop on the NFT thing, is that when you sell an NFT on the secondary market that I minted as the artist, I get a portion of every secondary sale forever. Mm-hmm. So whereas in the physical world, a piece of art is sold once and then the artist never sees money again, in the digital world, these contracts entitle the artist to residuals forever. And I was talking to a great digital artist named Joshua Davis, who's really big in the NFT world now. And he was like, Scott, I finally have a way to take care of my children and grandchildren. Like, this is amazing. As an artist, I will have a residual stream, of based on secondary sales forever.
Yeah. I mean, could you imagine if rather than the brokers, the artists were getting a percentage of every secondary sale?
Even a tiny one.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so in the interest of time, let's get to some questions from the team. So one from how important is design and creativity for low margin commoditized products and services? So you've talked about Apple and Nike and the high end products. How about industries with low margins such as transportation, right? How can these industries set themselves apart, with design?
I think it's a great question, because I think it's let's talk about stuff that isn't obvious yet. There's this assumption that in a commodities world that design is not important because it's a commodity. And yet design is the one thing that could increase willingness to pay for a commodity. Why would someone pay more for a commodity? Because the experience is better. And some might argue, well, that would never happen. Like, why would someone do that? But it happens all the time. I mean, why do we buy bottled water? Why do we, it's a lot of this stuff is just experience points. And so I think that design can be, used to increase the experiential value of something, the efficiency of it, the brand of it. So I think we're going to see a lot more of differentiation, in the kind of low end commodity type, space, through design.
Yeah. So how do we, as a corporate structure, how do we incentivize and foster empathy for our customers and colleagues? Understanding that empathy is sort of the key to user-centered design. Yeah. How do you stay close to that experience?
It's a great question, because I also always think about, everyone knows that customers are important, and what company doesn't want to be customer centric? But we're not built to be customer centric. I mean, unless you're a salesperson on the field, you're typically not even expected by your managers or straightforward rewarded, for that expenditure of time. And yet when you are shoulder to shoulder with customers, you get a sense of what their real struggles are. And it's not just about their struggles with your product, it's their struggles with the process around your product. Mm-hmm. because that oftentimes is where the new ideas strike. And I imagine in your space, that's like the equivalent of being on job sites, or being, being at the sale, or being at the application of materials, or whatever the case may be. And when you're experiencing that reality of how your product is used, you do then generate empathy for the characters, in that scene. You see that, I mean, to your point about the dumpster, in the yard, you're like, wow, like I didn't realize, every time that person comes home from work, they see that. All their neighbors see it. That's also a marketing opportunity. Like, why, shouldn't they know that our brand is associated with what the house is doing? And, it's almost like a billboard that we're getting for free in the front yard of a residential neighborhood. I think those insights only come from actually, being immersed in that. So in the digital world, and especially on consumer products, I always encourage my team to search Twitter for the brand of their product. And they will, in real time, they can spend 30 minutes every day engaging with customers that are either glorifying or complaining about their product.
Yeah.
And, how it's such a wake up call.
Yeah.
And then on the physical world, I have a number of examples of companies where they have every member of their team spend some time in customer service, answering phone calls or sitting next to the people answering phone calls. So they, for a couple of days, from the CEO down, everyone has to like experience, what customers are really saying, and whatever the equivalent might be, is one way to sensitize people.
Right. Here's another one. So you've spoken about the idea of the cultures of companies and culture fit. You analogize it to an immune system. So how do you balance that with diversity of thought? Can you have both employees that are a cultural fit, but also bring new perspectives, and and what are the qualities of a successful team that kind of balance that tension of culture fit versus fresh ideas or diversity of thought?
Yeah. Well, we often say, oh, that person wasn't a fit. And that is is a really big red flag, right? For a lack of tolerance around difference. If you're used to seeing a certain mold or a certain type of person around you from a certain college with a certain background, whatever, and then you see someone different, it's this part of our ancestral brain that makes us like question at first by default, as opposed to lean in and feel comfortable. And that's something we have to overcome in our organizations. I always like to start from the standpoint of what we're trying to achieve, which is innovation at the end of the day. We're trying to see, we're trying to know, the edge that will someday become the center. That's what we're all trying to do to some degree in order to, to push our businesses into the future. What better way to do that than to have people that think at the edge of reason as it relates to one another's ideas, right? So what's really reasonable to me will be reasonable to you if we're very similar and our backgrounds are similar and our experiences are similar. But if my background and my experiences are very different, what's reasonable to me may be unreasonable to you. And that's great, right? Because then suddenly in the group of decision makers, you have someone who hopefully you respect because you hired them, but is thinking at the edge of reason as it relates to your reason. And that's how we socialize those edges that may someday become the center. And so if we're going to stack the odds in favor of this happening more frequently, we have to hire extraordinarily different, extraordinary people. And so when I'm putting my teams together these days, I am starting to have an allure towards someone who like kind of thinks differently. And oftentimes they are someone who is quite different, is someone from whether it's a different race or gender or background or whatever. I mean, that's how you stack the deck in your favor.
Makes sense. And I feel like you also have to have, room or a home for skepticism, right? I mean, for people who sometimes, we always frame this in terms of pushing things forward, but I imagine it's just as important in terms of killing things off, or not pushing things forward, or saying that's a bad idea.
100%. And, tons of skepticism, not cynicism, right? So there's obviously a big difference between the two. But I also, I think that every, pardon the last analogy here, but in some ways, every great business is like a bonsai tree. and whenever you're cutting off those beautiful new branches and little leaves, those are the ideas. You're making the trunk stronger. You're making this bonsai tree into what it actually, becomes.
Yeah.
And so we have to kill things fast. And as a, I would say this is an area I've struggled with as a leader, because I always get excited about the possibility of new things. Like, who wants to cut off that little bud? Who knows what it will become? But every time I've made those difficult decisions, the team's energy gets refocused and concentrated on the things that matter most. And that's just time and time again.
Yeah. So here's another one. In starting your design work, how developed of initial concept do you start with? And through the development process, what criteria should be met to justify adjusting that initial concept? Is it, maybe some examples from your current work or things you've done?
Yeah, well, it's, it sort of brings up a cardinal rule for me when it comes to new products, which is empathy over passion. Because I find that a lot of great new products come out of a passion for a solution from some internal person at a company or some entrepreneur. And they say, oh my gosh, like, we should build this for the customer. And then it's this incredible journey where they build it out of their passion for a solution, only to realize that they were 30 degrees off of product market fit. And they brought it to market and they actually missed something that you only would have gotten through empathy. And so when you're building a product, be uncomfortably close to the end customers and what their experience will be, and keep kind of immersing yourself in it. And it will feel counterproductive because that time is not being spent building. And so you're like, oh, I mean, really going to go in the field again and like run through this again and try this again. But every single time, it's almost like a course correction. It like pushes you like 2 degrees or 3 degrees closer to the hot spot. And so, internally, with my teams, I am always trying to get them closer to customers. It's like, okay, we have this new feature in Photoshop for this or that or whatever. It's like, so how many of those print editors or whoever the people that were going to use that feature, like, how many have you sat next to? Have you seen their workflow? Have they gone through prototypes? Have they had an alpha version? Like, what's the data based on their usage? Did they use it again or not?
Do you have a sense of how much of that empathy is natural and how much can be learned by putting someone out there and having them engage with the customers in that way?
I actually think we all naturally have it to some degree. I don't think we all value it though.
Yeah.
So, and that's the difference. But if we're all forced to go through the hardship of, it's kind of like the classic example of the patient, the hospitals where they make a doctor be a patient for a day as part of their training. And because the doctors have no empathy with what it's like to sit half naked in the bed with the door open, and it's like, now having been a patient for a day, you're like, okay, I'm never going to leave that door open when I'm going to always close the door. But you only learn those things by being in the situation. And so how do you, and in your business, I know it may be tricky to imagine, but like, how do you like have a reward for people like getting in the field and, and getting a little bit closer to the bone of what the end experiences are that you're delivering?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, 2 more questions we have time for. One is, so how are some of the best companies balancing the intersection of brand purpose, brand experience, and design? Are there common themes or frameworks like design thinking that can, bring these together?
That's a good question. On brand purpose, I think, first of all, there's something very powerful about leveraging the skills of design to sort of show what a brand is all about. And, and I think if that's sort of one of those canon documents or canon experiences that you keep coming back to, it's as important for external customers as it is for internal employees, and it's obviously builds a sense of pride, et cetera. And it becomes, I guess the first term that comes to my mind is the term design system. And in our business right now, we're realizing that every company needs a design system. And what that means is a set of components or all the logos, the text, the fonts you use, but even some of the phrasing and the tone and all those things. How do you have a source of truth, like a library of all that stuff that then everyone, when they make marketing collateral, press releases, packaging, like are using? And I'm sure Standard has a design system that, that is being managed centrally. But that to me is part of that. It's that DNA that can help bring brand purpose across, because a lot of it's about consistency of message.
Right, absolutely. Okay, last question. How much of design is intuition and natural talent, and how much of it is just a rigorous process? How much of it is sweat and can be learned, or built through process?
Well, I'm going to cheat and I'm going to say it's half-half, because I honestly believe it is. I really believe that half of it. But the first part, I mean, a lot of design is really, especially experience design, is a lot. It's a lot of psychology too. It's, when I look at a product experience, the questions that I often ask myself as I'm evaluating it are around, like, how would I feel going through it? So at every step of the journey, do I know how I got there? Do I know what I'm supposed to do there? And do I know where I'm supposed to go next? Which is really about the object model of the experience, like the tabs, the breadcrumbs. How many choices am I having to make at each step, and how logical is it, and how am I seeing the progress I'm making? Those like status bars that we see in forms that we all fill out. They're there so that we feel comfortable. Like it's a design element, but it's actually coming from an insight into psychology. And so I do think half of it is that. And then to your point, like the other half is really, it's rigorous process. It's data-driven decision-making. It's testing things. It's questioning your assumptions. Like your intuition is oftentimes wrong, right? Like we all think something. And I always remind myself, like, I'm just a data point. I'm just a data point.
Yeah.
Like, how do I validate this?
Yeah. Terrific. Well, look, it's a fascinating conversation.
I loved it. Thank you.
I see a Scott Belsky sponsored trip to Japan for in the future.
Sign me up.
Yeah, exactly. We tried to go last year together. But thank you again. Thank you to everybody who's joined us, Scott Belsky, and look forward to continuing the conversation. So.
Thanks for having me, and I'm just honored to be a part of this great set of speakers.
Take care.